Iwi, e raurangatirama, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora. It's a pleasure to join you all today. And I'd especially like to thank the chair of the Auckland branch of the NZIIA, Dr. Ruben Azizian, for the invitation to speak to you this evening. Ruben approached me on a rainy day on a street in Wellington and collared me, and I find it very difficult to say no to great intellects who collar me on a street in Wellington. And perhaps it was Ruben's charm, and perhaps it was my anxiety to get out of the rain, but either way I said yes. So here I am. And a really warm welcome to, and a really great thank you to the number of distinguished people who've turned up this evening too. I'm really, really honoured that you've taken the time to come and listen. A new year and a change of government presents an opportunity to take a fresh look at the Australia-New Zealand relationship. We've seen since the election in November last year in New Zealand an energetic flurry of exchanges across the Tasman. Just before Christmas in December, Prime Minister Luxon made his first official visit to Australia to meet with Prime Minister Albanese. Of course, they met again only recently in Melbourne when Prime Minister Luxon made a visit to attend a dinner in the margins of the ASEAN-Australia Summit. And then in February, Australian and New Zealand foreign and defence ministers met for the first time in what we call a 2+2 format, which we're calling ANZMIN. It was significant because this was the first time that New Zealand had participated in a meeting on strategic policy in that format with anyone. And there have been numerous other ministerial visits and meetings too in recent months, including Finance Minister Willis's meeting with the Treasurer and meetings between our trade ministers. While it's been a bit of a tradition for our leaders and ministers to connect after a change of government, it's too easy to take it for granted. If you think about it for a moment, the priority we place on these exchanges is a sign of just how significant the Trans-Tasman relationship is to both of us. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. As we look ahead to 2024 and beyond, the pace of geopolitical and economic change is only accelerating. In the face of multiple concurrent challenges in our region and the world, the Australia-New Zealand partnership matters perhaps more now than it ever has. So I propose this evening to traverse how Australia sees these challenges, to describe our policy responses to them, and then to lay out for you how I see the shape of the Trans-Tasman partnership evolving to meet them. First, let me touch on what we're seeing in the world today. Some of you may be familiar with the Australia in the World podcast, and if not, I can highly recommend it. One of the co-hosts, Darren Lim, of the Australian National University, chose the word polycrisis as his 2022 word of the year. I think it's apt. The World Economic Forum has defined polycrisis as, quote, where disparate crises interact such that the overall impact far exceeds the sum of each part. A rather good word to sum up what we've been seeing around us. We are seeing multiple crises continue into 2024, with this February marking 2 years since Russia's illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Conflict in the Middle East persists, as does the devastating humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The Houthi attacks in the Red Sea have highlighted how conflict can threaten global trade security, supply chains, and affect inflation, and directly affect our economies and people even in this corner of the world. What is of particular concern, of course, is what is happening closer to home. The Pacific, the region we call home, is now fast becoming a theatre for strategic competition. In the South China Sea, a region essential for Australia and New Zealand's freedom of navigation and trade routes, we see intensified militarisation of disputed features and unsafe behaviour at sea and air. Indeed, militaries across the Indo-Pacific region are building and arming at a scale and speed we have not seen in decades, with little transparency or strategic reassurance. So if we ever thought that our geographic isolation provided protection from these trends, we're under no illusions now. Economically, outside of the COVID pandemic and the global financial crisis, the next 2 years are expected to be the weakest for global growth in over 2 decades. Inflation remains high for both Australia and New Zealand. Trade, investment, and industrial policy are increasingly being used as tools of influence. We're seeing economic coercion, unsustainable lending, political interference, and disinformation. All these undermine the ability of sovereign nations to make their own decisions and pursue their interests. And if that weren't enough, climate change is an existential threat, not least for our Pacific partners, to whom our own prosperity and security is tied and to whom we bear a responsibility. There are, of course, other challenges. I haven't yet, for instance, touched on the impact of artificial intelligence and rapid technology change, which will shape our economies and societies in good and not so good ways. All these developments taken together point to a world that is a multifaceted theatre for instability. I hope I've depressed you all. It's a grim picture, and one I expect that the people in this room are very familiar with. Some days, diplomacy feels like a contact sport. For those of us who worked in and around international relations, what we are seeing in terms of not just the individual issues, but the cumulative effect of multiple crises is unprecedented. It's clear that we are being called upon to adapt the tools, institutions, and tradecraft on which we've relied since the Second World War, pretty much, so that we are better equipped to meet these challenges and to protect our national interests. We also recognise that the speed of these developments means that we cannot delay our responses. As the Australian Treasurer Jim Chalmers told an audience here in Auckland just last year, this decade will be the defining decade for all of us. In the face of this, Australia's response has been grounded in a clear-eyed view of our national interest and what it will take to protect it. While this poly-crisis can seem overwhelming, our first principle is to recognise that we all have agency in how we respond. Foreign Minister Penny Wong has said that we should not present passivity as a feasible option. In other words, we should not think that it is possible to stand by and hope for the best while others make choices on our behalf. So how has Australia gone about exercising our agency? To continue my earlier anecdote, at the same time that Darren Lim nominated Polycrisis as his word of the year, his co-host and one of Australia's finest foreign policy minds, the late Alan Gyngell, nominated Statecraft as his 2022 word of the year. This word captures perfectly how Australia is responding. This is how the Australian government describes its policy approach, and I'll quote, "We are using all our tools of statecraft or national power to seek a region that is peaceful, stable and prosperous, that operates by agreed rules, standards and norms, and where each country can freely pursue its own interests and aspirations. Set against the challenges we face in the world, achieving this goal will require unprecedented coordination and ambition. It will take persistence and courage and involve our nation at home as well as overseas." So let me give you a few examples of how we're approaching this. For a start, foreign policy starts at home. Our starting point is to build our own domestic resilience. And to do that, we're engaging in a whole-of-nation effort. This requires all parts of our system to look ahead and to position Australia in the best way possible. So we're working to strengthen our economy, to build resilience in supply chains and infrastructure, to counter foreign interference, and to set ourselves up better for the future. Our climate policy is a case in point. In 2022, we legislated a stronger international emissions reduction target, lifting it from 26% to 43% below 2005 levels by 2030. This target isn't just a nice number out in the air. It's underpinned by a raft of domestic policies aimed at meeting this goal. Those policies include, for example, a target for renewable energy to comprise 82% of our national energy market by 2030. Now, that is a dramatic transformation. When I started working on climate change in the sort of about 2008, 2009, coal comprised 80% of our electricity generation. So we're looking at a complete flip in the structure of our energy generation in Australia. And all of that is being supported by investments in transforming Australia's electricity grid and rolling out large-scale community batteries. They include incentives for decarbonising the economy, so things like supporting households to switch to electrical appliances or broadening the uptake of electric vehicles. By the end of last year, we found that as a result of all these incentives and policies, we were within striking distance of our target. But perhaps more importantly, what those policies will do is to drive a transformation toward a more efficient and stronger economy that will do well in a fossil fuel future. Building our cyber resilience is becoming an ever more important goal. In November last year, Australia introduced its first cyber security strategy. By 2030, we aim to be the most cyber secure country in the world and a global leader in cyber security. We are shifting cyber from a technical topic to a whole of nation endeavour, focusing on providing better support to civilians and industry. Our aim is not just to protect, but also to ensure we can bounce back quickly after a cyber incident. And these incidents are, unfortunately, happening with ever-increasing frequency. Similarly, we've created a robust legislative framework for defining and regulating protection of critical infrastructure for key sectors in the economy, things like energy, transport, infrastructure, healthcare, foods production and supply. And those measures are not just about protecting our ability to trade, but actually protecting our ability to function and then to engage in the world economy. It understands that a modern and robust economy is necessary to support our strategic weight and our ability to contribute to peace and security in the region. So let's go out of the country and think internationally for a moment. And the reason we are trying to build our domestic resilience is because we understand that national security doesn't just start at our coastline, at our physical border. It starts at home. Our Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister, Richard Marles, has observed that any adversary who sought to harm Australia could likely do so before ever having to enter our territorial waters or our airspace. This is why we continue to press for responsible management of great power competition, and also why we feel we have to exercise our agency to maintain the peace. So in addition to building domestic resilience, we're trying to maintain our national security through using levers of statecraft to balance deterrence with assurance. What we're looking for is a balance between defence and diplomacy. Let me step out for you what that means. At one end of the spectrum, Australia's defence policy and strategic posture is built on a principle of deterrence. That is the ability to hold any potential adversaries at risk much further from our shores. This principle has underpinned recent decisions by the Australian government on defence investments, as outlined in the 2023 Defence Strategic Review. Those decisions include the acquisition of nuclear-propelled submarines and advanced technologies under the AUKUS partnership. Now, I'm conscious there's quite a lot of debate about the AUKUS partnership here as well as in Australia, and that debate is healthy, but it can overshadow a clear understanding of the broader strategic intent. It's worth noting that these submarines form only one part of Australia's wider defence strategy that also includes, for instance, strengthening our northern approaches or investing in long-range strike. As we also know from the actions of others, large investments in defence capability can raise regional anxieties if they're not also accompanied by transparency and strategic reassurance. Diplomacy lies at the heart of strategic reassurance and also at the heart of the practice of national statecraft. As put by Minister Wong earlier this year, this means working to build coalitions, foster assurance, reduce tensions, avert crisis, and to prevent and help resolve disputes. There's a fundamental connection. This is why I mentioned the two, defence and diplomacy. There's a connection between the two. So the way Minister Wong explained it is this. She said, without a credible military capability, the efficacy of diplomacy is inevitably diminished. And without ever more active diplomacy, the risk of military capabilities being called into service is greater, which is why Australia is now investing much more heavily in strengthening our diplomacy. Turn the page. Excuse me, bear with me. So on diplomacy, we are actively supporting the multilateral system and key regional institutions such as the Pacific Islands Forum to shore up international and regional norms. While we will always have global interests, our primary focus is in our region, in the Indo-Pacific and, in particular, Pacific. We're working with our closest regional partners in the Pacific to deepen trust and strengthen our partnerships, building on relationships that are, in many instances, many decades old. Because even though the world has changed, our geography has not. This is our home, this is our region. So we start by being present. Since the Pacific Step Up in 2018, Australia has established a diplomatic mission in every Pacific Island country. We have 18 in all now. Within 12 months of her appointment, Foreign Minister Wong visited every Pacific Island country, some more than once. Her visits have been supplemented by numerous visits by other Australian leaders to the region, including the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and the Minister for International Development and the Pacific. We've used these visits to listen, to learn, and to respond to Pacific concerns. For example, Australia's international development policy, which I highly recommend you read, last year made clear that respecting Pacific priorities is central to our engagement with them on development. In the Pacific, this has meant we are taking climate action seriously. We are investing in critical infrastructure in the region to support their efforts, but we're also bringing our credibility to bear by what we are doing at home. We're not just talking the talk, we're walking the walk as well. Together with other Pacific partners, such as New Zealand, we are contributing to Pacific security, for example, through supporting the Solomon Islands Assistance Force or working with our Pacific partners to combat illegal fishing. We're supporting the Pacific Islands Forum as the premier institution in the region, which has had a long and successful track record of collective action to preserve the prosperity and security of the Pacific family. In all of our diplomacy, we know that we cannot achieve the kind of region we seek alone. Alliances, partnerships, and institutions play a critical role, and you will have seen a real rise in Australia's engagement in plurilateral and minilateral groupings, such as the Quad or in trilateral engagements over the last decade or so. Nowhere do we have a better partner than New Zealand. And this has now been affirmed by our Trade Minister recently in the Senate. So I'm not just saying that. It is something that is genuinely held. Around the world, and especially in the Pacific, New Zealand has a respected voice and a vital presence. While internationally our two countries are often closely associated with each other, it is the unique differences that we each bring to the partnership which make us stronger together. Our unity does not necessarily mean uniformity, and that is a good thing. For Australia, there is no relationship as close and trusted as that with our Trans-Tasman neighbour. So this trust opens up the potential for us to think bigger and go further than we might with any other partner. The great example, of course, is the Closer Economic Relations Agreement that we signed in 1983, which was then considered, it was one of the first free trade agreements in the world, was then considered a gold standard agreement and continues to be considered a gold standard agreement. In the 40 years since the CER was signed, it has delivered prosperity and benefits to each of our countries that are in many ways immeasurable. We take for granted today how closely integrated our economies are, yet it hasn't come about by accident. The CER is a triumph of collaboration over competition. The world today is, of course, very different to 1983. Our risks today are geostrategic as well as economic. So it makes sense to consider how our partnership can adapt to meet those challenges. Last year, our two Prime Ministers launched the Trans-Tasman Roadmap to 2035. The roadmap marks a departure in how we think and talk about our relationship. Taking the global environment we face today as its starting point, the roadmap identifies 5 areas where Australia and New Zealand have agreed to focus our efforts over the next decade. And these are, first of all, a sustainable economic partnership. That's not just the CER type single economic market, even though it's definitely there. It's about taking that beyond that to building green economies, working together on climate change, moving into new directions. The second is cooperating on security and resilience, recognising the value of our alliance, investing in it, building defence interoperability, and working towards regional security and stability. The third area is partnering in the Pacific, bringing our individual relationships, strengths, and approaches to bear in a joint enterprise with our Pacific partners. Fourthly is the joint effort that we have in upholding global principles, values, and norms. And finally, of course, maintaining our people-to-people links, which are absolutely the bedrock of the relationship between us. If that list seems unsurprising, then it's perhaps because you all recognise, as I do, that Australia and New Zealand have been working in all of these areas, and many more besides, for a very long time. But what the roadmap does is to create a framework, a way of thinking about how what our relationship is. It will help us clarify our focus. Without this, we risk trying to do everything and achieving very little. And you'll notice that each of these 5 themes have a strong resonance with the areas of focus that I sketched out earlier for responding to global challenges, be it in building domestic resilience, strengthening our defences, or using diplomacy to advocate for peace and stability. That New Zealand also shares these priorities is a reflection of the strong natural alignment between us. Australia and New Zealand, as I've said before, will each bring different ideas, skills, and capabilities to this effort. And I'm confident that together we can make a difference for the better in our region in the world. And in finishing, I just really want to make a case, perhaps a bit of a plea, for looking at the relationship between us with fresh eyes. I find that too often we resort to history to describe ourselves. We actually often don't have words to describe or articulate what the bilateral relationship is. But when we do, We speak of our shared Anzac tradition, or we talk about the sense that we are family. Those things are important and they are right, but we do our relationship a disservice if we allow ourselves to be defined only in such sentimental terms. It's a short step from that to taking each other for granted. Better, I think, to continue to work to build a mature, respectful relationship between equals that is fit for the 21st century. And to work to look to the future, to consider how we can harness our incredible foundation of trust, confidence, and shared values, not just to our mutual benefit, but to meet the very considerable challenges that the world is throwing at us, and perhaps to make the world a better place. So here's something to consider. In 2024, there will be at least 64 elections, including in the United States, Russia, Indonesia, Solomon Islands, and India. The results of some of these will prove consequential for years to come and will impact not just those countries or their neighbours, but quite probably the state of freedom and democracy around the world. If you think about it, Australia and New Zealand were founding members of the United Nations. We have a great deal of moral weight in the world. We have a long history of championing liberty and openness to make a real difference. And we can do the same now, using the clever and creative diplomacy that we are each renowned for. Harnessing our respective strengths at home and internationally is both urgent and important if we want to have a say in the kind of regions and world we live in. And I look forward to seeing what we can do together, and in my own small way, to playing a part in that. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Harinder. So we have time for questions. Would you like to hydrate yourself?
Yes, I do.
And please, Helen.
Yes, Hi Commissioner, thank you very much for that. You did mention this is the year of elections. One election that has already happened very close to us, even closer to you, which may impact on both our countries, is Indonesia. Massive country, about third in the population in the world, nominally the largest Muslim population. We've just elected an extremely unpleasant man called Prabowo Subianto. Do you have any comment on how he has already said he is going to promote Indonesia as a leader in the world? Do you have any comment on that?
So I think my talking points tell me to welcome the conduct of the elections in Indonesia as a step forward in its democracy. I mean, it's fair to say, to be honest, we have come a long way from fretting about Indonesia as a source of strategic risk for Australia. The relationship that we have with Indonesia now is arguably the strongest, and it continues to be strong and continues to grow as we go forward. It's no accident that our Prime Minister and Foreign Minister made their very first bilateral visit to Indonesia upon being elected. It continues a long tradition of that engagement. And it's actually engagement that will get us going down this path. And from the time that Australia had started to see our region and our security in the Indo-Pacific, rather than talking just about the Asia-Pacific, Indonesia has come very much more to the fore as a key partner. We also know that Indonesia will be critical in ASEAN as the kind of centre weight in ASEAN to provide direction and to provide depth and weight to ASEAN's support for freedom and liberty in the region. So there are many reasons why we can work with Indonesia, and we will continue to do so no matter the colour of the government, because I think our relationship with Indonesia is very, very strong and will be able to withstand that for quite some time to come. Thank you.
Thank you. There and there.
So again, thank you so much for that, those insights. It was really, really great. I have a question that I think talks to your pedigree as a diplomat, and also perhaps to Professor Rubin's approach of rules-based approach, moving very, very quickly to a power-based approach. So you mentioned that diplomacy and statecraft is fundamentally unchanged for nearly 80 years, and is based on that rules approach to diplomacy. How do you feel that is working against an adversary that can either be asymmetric, it can be non-human, in the case of both IA and climate change, and very much a power-based approach? Is it time for a sort of step up, an innovative approach to diplomacy, or does that rules-based statecraft still work?
I think I've covered a lot of that, in the themes of what I've said. I do think it is worth fighting for rules. We're going to have to fight for rules. And the reason we have to fight for rules is because countries that don't have the size to work unilaterally, and that's most of us, and that does include Australia, do better under clear rules where everyone agrees and operates in concert with each other. And so there is something to be said about standing up for those rules. Standing up for those rules is not just saying nice things in the United Nations any longer. That used to be enough. But actually it is about backing that up with action. So this is why I talk about the intertwining of defence and diplomacy increasingly. It's just where the world has gone. It's not that we are being aggressive in doing that, but actually we're taking a realistic look at what we will need to do to get there. Similarly, a tool of statecraft now, in our mind in Australia, is actually what we are doing in terms of investing in the strength of our economy domestically. There is not a part of the system that doesn't impact on our ability to secure our security. And one small example, there was a series of press articles doing the round in Australia a few days ago or so, where it was made clear that the Secretary of the Department of Climate Change is now being made a member of our National Security Committee of Cabinet. Now, that is a real sign that we see where we're going in terms of climate issues or in terms of economic issues as having strategic relevance and salience. And so we do have to think differently. As diplomats, what does this mean? It means we can't sit quietly and just kind of do all the things that I used to love doing, for most of my career, which is just spending my time looking at Middle East politics and not really caring what is happening at home. The linkages between those two things are just much stronger. What's going on in the world and what is happening at home are things that we have to be well versed in as diplomats across the board. So that's really where I would come from on that.
Thank you. Fair.
Good day, Commissioner. I'm Jackson, former member of NZIIA Wellington. Back in maybe 2016, 2017, when I was studying international relations and strategic studies in Wellington, I remember Hugh White, the Australian professor. He was the prevailing kind of realist voice in Australia at the time, saying we need to double the defence budget. And he's saying all these outrageous things. And then he was, he'd get laughed at a lot of the time back then, but quite quickly, the kind of school of neorealism, the Hugh White school of strategic studies, slowly started creeping into policy. And we look at AUKUS and the Quad and, the US Boeing factories in Australia and the Loyal Wingman program and all these things which are very cool in my opinion as a realist. What's changed in a short amount of time? Strategic competition heating up quickly in I guess, fairly rapid losing of faith in these institutions, and a lean into that power projection capability. What happened, and is it going to keep happening?
Hugh's a good friend, actually, and I worked with him first when we were working on the year 2000 white paper, which is, I believe, to this day is named because Hugh White wrote it. And even then, Hugh was running around saying we should double the defence budget. So it's been kind of a bit of a theme. But that said, I don't want to discount what Hugh says, because actually he is somebody who does make us think. And, you know, what we have in Australia is very active and vocal debate. Hugh is one voice amongst many on all of this. If you ask why we have been having a steady uptick in our defence budget really for a very long time. John Howard in the late 90s and early 2000s committed to a 3% real growth in the defence budget year on year, pretty much out to perpetuity, which means that you end up with, you know, quite a significant growth in the defence budget. So that's been going on for a very long time. And we do that because actually Australia feels, you know, we are right at the coalface of where some of the strategic instability is there. We think much more directly and seriously about our defence than anyone else. But what I want to say is a couple of things. One is that the shifts in the investment and the ability to the uptick in capability that we have made in terms of our investments, say in the last decade or so, have not been because a whole bunch of hawks have suddenly taken over the Australian government. It's because any decision we make on force structure has its roots in a clear-eyed strategic assessment about what we're seeing around us. We don't ever have an offensive capability. We never will have one. It has never been in our military doctrine, ever. But what this is a response to what we are seeing in the world. It is actually a response to where we are seeing global capability go, and it's come from a judgment that says we can either let all of that go and we can fall further behind, or we can actually discharge our duty as a government to protect our security. And that is what our governments have, repeated governments of all colours, have chosen to do. And the advantage that we feel that we're doing, what we feel we're doing is to take prudent steps to secure not just our own country, but actually other countries around us as well, who are in the same boat and who don't have the ability to make that investment. So that's really what is driving it. It is not, there's nothing more and nothing less than that. And then the final point I'll make is this: the real shift that we have made in the last year or two is to recognise that we cannot just charge off and focus on our national security through defence alone. In fact, the best and the cheapest national security we can have, and I hope I've made this clear, is to invest in diplomacy, is to expand our diplomatic footprint, is to engage more with countries, to really invest in our development effort, and not to securitise all our relationships, but to genuinely work on building relationships of trust. And that is the wholesale effort that is underway right now as well.
Gary, thank you. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, heri mai, heri mai, eke Tatianga Mapuka. I'd just like to pick up, the UN 215 stated there was to be decolonisation within 5 years. They pointed to the Pacific Ocean area as an area of real concern. And my point I'd like to make is from the Indigenous points of view, like my own iwi connections, is that we look at Australia, we look at Bougainville, we look at Norfolk Island, which still today on the International Criminal Court of Justice, Australia's on the court bench there in regards to removal of the independence and the parliament of the Norfolk Island people. There's Christmas Island, which is closer to Indonesia than it is to Australia. And my question is, you're the one that said regards words, we need now the actions. We then have the big power of France, we have on our doorstep internal, and we only have our own Cook Island people. We don't even put into our defence strategy, even though they are part of us. We don't think of them when it comes to that conflict situation. So I say there's going to be more actions from our nations to prove to the Pacific people, through my ties and media and that through the family and everybody, that what we get from the people up in the islands.
Gary, thank you for your question. Just want to say one thing, that for us, and as you're probably aware, Australia's been on a journey in terms of Indigenous reconciliation. We continue to do that. It's largely been focused at home, but it's a journey. We are on our way, and we'll get it right sometimes and we'll get it wrong at other times. But what we have done is to try to take forward our First Nations foreign policy as well. And so last year we appointed our first ever ambassador for First Nations Australians, and Justin Muhammad, who is doing precisely that. Starting point is to listen and learn. So he has been consulting with Australian Indigenous communities, and his role is to take that perspective out into the world in our engagement, to focus on the Pacific, to learn as well from them, and to see what that can be, how that can be fed back to our policy. So that process is underway. Probably won't go as fast as many people would like it to, but we are conscious of it and we are working towards that.
Hi, Commissioner. To continue with difficult questions, we know that
They're the best ones.
2/3 of Australians prefer to be a republic, that the issue appears to have been shelved this year. Obviously, we are interested because where Australia leads, New Zealand will probably follow within a decade.
You're asking me whether Australia is going to be a republic?
Has the issue been permanently shelved, or is it just a short-term expedient? Or
Oh, I mean, we've had since 2022 a Minister for the Republic. It's definitely something that's on the agenda. The question is, when is a sensible time to raise that? And those are political judgments that are made by the government. What is clear is that in order to achieve that, we would need constitutional change. And our government has chosen to prioritise the effort so far into seeking constitutional change to effect an Indigenous voice to Parliament. We went to referendum last year. I think we will need some time to consider the outcome of that and to settle us down, I guess, a bit before we go into another process for constitutional change again. I assume that's what the government's consideration is. In any case, wherever the political judgments are made, and that's completely outside of my wheelhouse, I have no idea where that is. It's, you don't pull these things out of thin air. There has to be a national conversation. And so I think, that would be where we might invest in it. Is it a live issue in Australia right now? I'm not so sure it's the biggest issue that Australians feel we need to grapple with. But it's been there for a long time, and perhaps as demographics change, we might go there, but I couldn't give you a time frame. I don't really know the answer to that.
Kia ora, Commissioner. My name's Danny. I'm actually from Townsville, up in North Queensland. I moved to Auckland in 2019.
Left the tropics to come here.
Decisions were made. Of course, as a strong Republican, I do believe that Barnaby Joyce is the true Trans-Tasman connector, President of Australia. You're joking, sorry. I have got a pre-written question here, and I'm 27. I'm a master's student over at the University of Auckland. Not the usual combination to come over from Australia to New Zealand, and that's really the root of the question. Which is that domestic politics in New Zealand often ask that question a lot of why are so many Kiwis just going to Australia? Why is there a perception of brain drain? Why is it that the Queensland state government is recruiting so many people? You see, looking on Seek and all other things, plenty of ads that involve a move over to Australia. On a separate but related note, there's the issue of international flights and the passenger movement charge. This was an issue that when I was in Townsville doing a bit of work up there with Townsville Enterprise, it was raised as one of the things was holding back the Townsville International Airport. It wasn't that before, and it's not that anymore. There's a reason for that. But it was raised that was an issue that was preventing these short-range, really budget flights. As an Australian over here to go back to see my family in Brisbane, go to Townsville, that is a considerable charge for me. So I suppose the question for me is, there is the question of security, there is the question of international development, of defence, and these major issues. But as well as that, I think there are these domestically challenging points. Should the Trans-Tasman connection be making more exemptions to things like the passenger movement charge to really prioritise essentially friendship, connection over income? And should it really find a way to better opportunities for people in New Zealand, particularly in the public sector, even in business, so that there is that incentive, not just to move to Australia where there is a stronger economy, but to seek to really add to New Zealand's economy to essentially answer that domestic political question as well?
Okay, I think you're not going to be particularly satisfied with this answer, but yes. I don't know the answer on the passenger movement charge, but I do know that the CER and the single economic market that sits underneath it, there's a very strong principle of having a seamless connection between us as we possibly can manage. So there are forums where those issues are discussed. So I really genuinely don't know whether the PMC's actually been raised in that forum and talked about, but it would seem to me that that's the sort of thing that we are trying to do to make the connections between us as seamless as possible. And the reason we do that is because of the economic benefit it gives both of us, not just one country or the other. I can't really go to the question about what opportunities you can provide here in New Zealand. It's not for me to say. Those are judgments of the government here and the judgments that the government have to make. What I can say is that both Australia and New Zealand are united in a sense that we do need to make life as good and as easy as possible for Australians who choose to come here or for New Zealanders who choose to go to Australia. So last year, Prime Minister announced a rapid pathway to citizenship for New Zealanders resident in Australia, allowing them to access all the rights of Australian citizens with relative ease. And so that's the kind of thing that we work on, but we can't, the push and pull factors are often economic issues that occur in both countries, and they do go up and down, they're cyclical over time. How you create incentives to change those factors is a matter for domestic policy, and I wouldn't dare to venture into that space.
Thank you. Question here and then there.
Well, I'm not going to ask a question. I just want to declare this is a friend of mine, Harinder, and a colleague, and I don't think I've ever heard a High Commissioner for Australia speak so well about understanding from New Zealand perspective the relationship. So thank you very much for that. Harinder and I know that geography sets the relationship for both of us. And she said today some of the things that I wish we would listen to a little bit more about the nature of the challenge that each of us faces here. So there's an Allen Ginsel aphorism that Simon Murdoch used to quote about same bed, different nightmares. Australia's a strategic threat, New Zealand's economic irrelevance. I think they have moved on a bit, but we are always going to be their closest neighbour and friend, and they will always be important to us. So thank you very much for what you've done tonight.
North Garland was closer. Closest neighbour.
Maria, question?
Good again, High Commissioner. So recently the European Parliament has approved the first artificial intelligence legislation in the world. And my question is, do you see Australia following that path in the near future? And are you excited or concerned about AI?
Oh, I think I'm both excited and concerned. I mean, like with all new technology, right? And I'm a very big fan of technology because actually it's what gives us productivity, it opens opportunity, whole new vistas of economic and other activity, new ways of conducting social relationships all open up with technology. If I think about it myself, until social media came along, I had relatives that I hadn't contacted in decades, and suddenly I could be in touch with my cousin in Florida again, you know, fantastic. Everything has a good side and a downside. I don't know where we are. We are still thinking through on regulation of AI. I think there's a lot we still don't know and don't understand about it. As far as I know, Australia is considering a set of principles around AI rather than legislation itself. And my guess is we will test that and see how that goes and then sort of take it from there. But it does open up some very exciting opportunities for the world. And the trick for us, I think, both Australia and New Zealand, is to get the best out of it while managing any of the risks.
Jody.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. High Commissioner, pardon me. In 2017, the Australian High Court came out with a court decision which had a nasty effect on Australian businesses potentially setting up operations in New Zealand. And what happened was the ATO and Inland Revenue figured out some ways of patching things up so that those nasty tax consequences didn't eventuate. And then in 2020, the previous Australian government announced law changes that would essentially counteract that court decision. And ever since, there's been radio silence from both the previous and now present governments. Is there any likelihood of change in that area?
Just had to check with my expert over here. I think this has in my time been a subject for discussion. And I am aware, and I think all I can say right now is I'm aware that we are opening up conversations with New Zealand on how to resolve that issue. Again, the principle underpinning everything that we do with New Zealand is the single economic market principle. And sometimes that just butts up against, we do lots of things in Australia that have unintended consequences for New Zealand because they make sense inside of a federal Australian system. And sometimes we have to go back and retrofit the single economic market principle in there. So the best I can say to you is perhaps we're not saying a lot publicly, but I am conscious that there are conversations underway.
Well, Harinder, I have a question, if you don't mind. You mentioned 60+ elections this year, and some are probably more important than others, and some are more predictable than others. We already have, I think, 2 unpleasant men being elected, one in Indonesia, one in Russia. So there is a possibility another unpleasant man will be elected in a very important country of the United States. Europe is already dreading about that. Europe is preparing to, challenged by one unpleasant man sitting in Moscow, and is already looking forward to a situation where they will have to rely more on themselves and build up their security and defense. So what should democracies of this part of the world do in case there is an unpleasant man who may invite China to invade countries who don't spend enough on defense in this part of the world, and we will be very vulnerable to that. Is there a contingency between Australia and New Zealand about that? How do we, make sure we talk about overdependence on China for trade. How about some of the relationship in Quad and AUKUS that are dependent on what happens in the #1 major power? So is there any thinking by Hugh White and others about that?
I think the answer to unpleasant men is to elect more women. I may just say so myself.
Well, she portrayed that. Yeah, Helen stepped down.
Yeah, I know. Well, I can see lots of fabulous women here who I would happily follow. And look, it's our business, I think, as diplomats to look at worst case scenarios all the time and to plan for them. It's worth remembering in the Quad, there are other partners beyond the US. There's Japan and India who are becoming very much more important powers. We're also living in a world where actually it is multipolar. I didn't make as much as I could have about one of the levers of statecraft that we're using is to invest more in partnerships. And we're using, it's kind of what we're calling flexible geometry, partnerships in different combinations around the world to build a network, a webbing, I suppose, of trust and confidence amongst countries that are like-minded in different combinations. I think that will form a really good basis for, I guess, sort of an insurance policy, if you like. It's very difficult to work out hypothetically what scenarios look like down the track with Russia or China or even the US and the major powers, because they will do what they will do anyway, or to predict what the outcome of the United States election is going to be. So the best we can do is to invest in strengthening our own ability to withstand whatever shocks come our way, and to build relationships of trust with as many partners as we can to kind of help support us in that process. We've been through so many cycles with many countries around the world, and you know, something I guess I know, and you probably know from your training as well, is that actually where there is an alignment of interests between countries, that tends to withstand a particular leader or another. And the path of that relationship might expand or it might contract in small periods of time, but ultimately there is a values and an interests alignment that relationship will remain solid. So I think we'll continue to invest in the shared interests that we have, and we'll just have to take whatever comes our way when it does.
Thank you, thank you. And we took note of your suggestion about more women in leadership. Maybe last question, and then yes, please.
Thank you, High Commissioner. My name is Summer from New Zealand China Council. If I could be greedy to ask 2 questions, if that's okay. So I think by default, I should ask 1 question about China because of my job. What do you, on the news about Mr. Foreign Minister Wang Yi visiting both New Zealand and China this week, how do you view the relationship between New Zealand and China versus between Australia and China? What are the similarities for both countries? Because the relationships for both countries with China is very important and complex at the same time. So what are the similarities and what are the unique challenges for Australia compared to New Zealand? That's my number 1 question. And number 2 could be a simple one. What's your advice for young professionals in pursuing a career in diplomacy? What's your advice for young women, female, leadership development?
I've got a young.
I'm not sure that is the simple one, but go ahead.
On our relationship with China, unless you've been hiding under a rock the last few years, you know that Australia's had a rather interesting time of it in our relationship with China. So,
Wine to that.
I think the wine might be coming back with me. And I think that it's good of you to pose this in the context of Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit recently, because I think that that's kind of really articulated that relationship. What's very interesting when you look at the data is that a greater proportion of Australia's exports, slightly greater, goes to China as compared to a proportion of New Zealand's exports. I think it's something like about 32, 34%, 34, 36%. But roughly, we're both sitting at about a little over a third of our exports go to China. And there's a very, very strong economic linkage with China, and both countries have that. Both countries also have quite long-standing relationships with China. We both renewed diplomatic relations, or we both established diplomatic relations with the PRC in the same year. There's the same sort of trajectory to that. Both of us also have very large Chinese diasporas in our own countries. And so people who have come, worked, pay taxes, and contribute to our economy. And for a very long time, and till now, we see China as a net positive for our economy. We have been vocal and clear, both countries, about concerns we have about Chinese behaviour, for example, in the South China Sea. And this goes to the heart of our support for the rules-based order, because going back to what I said, Australia and New Zealand were founding partners of the founding members of the United Nations. These are values we hold very dear. Where we have been with China recently in Australia is with the incoming Albanese government is to move to stabilising our relationship with China after a period where we have suffered economic sanctions with China. And that's been the key distinction between the relationship that Australia's had and the relationship that New Zealand's had. That relationship is now stabilising. We're very, very glad to see that it is moving back onto what I would call a normal footing of a relationship. The visit by Minister Wang Yi was another step forward in that stabilisation of the relationship. And I believe there was mention of looking forward to a more senior visit down the track as well. That's all to the good. And frankly, if what we are looking for is to preserve peace and stability, then active and positive economic relationships and countries working together, being able to speak to each other and to engage with each other face to face, because communication is key to a relationship. That, I think, is what will really matter. We need to each understand where the other is coming from. And that's a two-way conversation, not a one-way conversation. And I think both Australia and New Zealand are very much aligned on trying to get to that kind of relationship with China. What surprised me, I guess, in a positive sense and a good sense, is how similar the language was in the statements that were made about the Wang Yi visit, both in New Zealand and in Australia. There really wasn't a great deal of difference. The particular issues we talked about might have differed, but actually the kind of language we used to describe that, the language we used to talk about the relationship is very similar. There's actually more that we have in common than we don't in that. And I think it's been, when you have a relationship like Australia and New Zealand that's so close, I think we tend to over-focus on the things that are different. Whereas actually, when you think about it, there's a lot more that's similar than not. So hopefully that gets you there. Advice for young people. Well, I actually think we need. So we in Australia have now, I think we've nearly doubled our intake of young diplomats into foreign affairs. I think that now more than ever, we want to have young people joining foreign affairs, working in international relations, working in this, engaging more in the world than we ever have been. And the reason is because the world is just much more interconnected than it ever has been. You can't sit at home and do any job domestically and for it not to have an international dimension any longer. And least of all, if you live in this corner of the world. There is no way we can just shut ourselves off now from what's going on in the world. We're going to have to be a part of it. Personally, I think there is no more rewarding career. The ability to not just do a job where you think big, but actually where in some small way you have the ability to influence and shape how things go in the world is an opportunity like no other. So I would do an awful lot to encourage more international thinking by young people and certainly encourage them to come. When they come into their foreign ministries, it's also about, like you do anywhere else in public service, trying to understand the world from the perspective of a government that has to govern and work in it. And that's very different from the perspective of an individual who has views and opinions about things. So that'll be the next thing. And finally, because my good friend here and I have had the conversation, we should try to encourage not just young people or young women, but young people and young women of all different backgrounds to join our foreign services. We must have a foreign service that reflects, that looks like, and that represents the people we see on the street every day, who we represent when we go overseas. And that means cultural diversity as well as gender diversity in our foreign services. And as I've been saying, that I've been a big champion of this inside DFAT in Canberra. I continue to talk about it a lot, and we may well be inching in foreign affairs towards a cultural diversity target. I'm not retiring till that happens, but it would be a good thing because we've got to show the world who we really are, and who we really are is everybody who we see out there in the street should be reflected by the way we represent ourselves to the world. That's it.
Thank you. Some of the promising future cadre of the Foreign Service actually are proactive members of the Institute of International Affairs. So before you apply for MPAD, try your skills with us, dear young people of all various cultural and other diversities. So your friend Francesca would like to offer a vote of thanks. Friend?
Here you go.
Yeah, kia ora everyone. My name is Francesca and I'm the administrator for NZIIA. I'm not as much of a stand-up comedian as Ruben, so please bear with me. But yeah, I have a privilege of just thanking you, High Commissioner Sidhu, on behalf of our committee, but also on behalf of everyone here. So should we really just put our hands together for your inspiration, full stop. But also, I think, thank you so much for your informative presentation. And actually, it was really hopeful, though it did start off with quite a depressing moment there. I've never actually heard all the problems listed out like that and nearly got a heart attack. But reality check, truly reality check. And just to hear about all the polycrisis that is going on, ranging from military, economics, political problems, technology problems, maybe environmental problems, societal problems, and actually essentially problems that I think we can say every single one of us here have felt individually as well, to some extent. And so thank you for giving us that reality check, though in a hard way. But also thank you for reminding us that actually we can make a change as well. Though we can't change the world, we can make little steps. And thank you for sharing with us about Australia and your statecraft. I hope you make a new word next. Maybe yours is the next big word. But yeah, Australia's policy. And really, I'm inspired that you guys are concentrating on strengthening your own systems. And maybe that's something that New Zealand should look to as well. And also how, though challenges do have ripple effects, changes and good changes hopefully will have ripple effects as well, whether from technology to economics to political to military. Yeah, and thank you for stating that we are your best friend, even though there's a big debate, I know, over in Australia.
Not in my book.
But we are stuck together geographically. But we do look forward, and thank you for challenging us to actually rethink this partnership that we have with Australia and to not take it for granted and actually to challenge it, to expand it from this generation to the next generation. So it won't be easy from here on. I think we all know it won't be easy. And I think Ruben kind of honed it in with the number of bad people that have been elected. It won't be easy, but it's good to know, I think, at least from a New Zealander perspective, that we're not navigating this alone. We have a lot to learn from you, and I think Australia also has a lot to learn from us. So really excited about this mutual learning and partnership that we have. So once again, thank you so much, and thank you, Erin, for also being here. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank you to Kathy and NZIIA for hosting us here, to Ruben and the rest of my team as well for organising this. And most of all, thank you to all of you for attending. Without you, we wouldn't be possible in this committee. But also thank you for your interest. Without your interest, then there's no going forward as well. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I have, Harinder, I have also a very short vote of thanks in terms of thank you for your generosity and for radically changing my perception of what a good weather in Wellington is about. So I always encourage you to travel to Wellington and try to be there on a rainy day. And there will always be a lonely-looking senior diplomat who can be approached and invited to come and speak. So thank you so much for that generosity. We have all present for you, which is called The State of Threat, the Challenges to Aotearoa New Zealand's National Security, which is published by a group of Hugh Whites of New Zealand. And according to Ruben, I will, yeah, it has 24 chapters, but you should start from the back because my from reliable beehive sources, we were told that this was one of the 3 books that Chris Luxon had to read before he started his job. I haven't heard him quote me or anyone else. So that alarms me a little bit, but hopefully you'll find it useful. And thank you so much once
Thank you very
again.
much.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone. And until we meet again, we will have a meeting soon. We'll have a UK High Commissioner in May. We have a speaker on Rwanda again in May, so you will be informed. If you're not a member, it's an opportunity to become a member. New committee members, please stay after this one for our second round of elections. Thank you. All the best.
We have elections now. Oh, you guys, you really.
If you're taking some time, I'd like to sit down.
I am.
Thanks, Mr. Wellington.
How you going?
You must be climate change.
Yes, I am.